Stroy one new alone home. The Grand Arrival, massive extended version. Zara and Amir drove through the winding roads for what felt like hours, their excitement mounting as they neared the house they'd been waiting for, a sprawling, secluded estate deep in the heart of an ancient forest. The isolation was one of the reasons they had fallen in love with it. Tall trees lined the gravel driveway, their branches twisting together overhead to create a thick canopy, blocking out much of the late afternoon sunlight. The dense foliage swallowed any signs of civilization, leaving them in eerie silence as they pulled up to the gate. The house, looming before them, was far larger than Zara had imagined from the photos. An immense, ivy-covered structure with Gothic arches and towering spires. Its stone walls were dark and weathered, giving the impression that it had stood there for centuries, witnessing countless secrets in the stillness of time. It looked like it had been plucked from an old, forgotten horror movie, a relic of the past, untouched by modern life. Amir was thrilled. "It's even better in person," he exclaimed as he stepped out of the car, his voice echoing through the quiet yard. Zara, however, felt a chill roll down her spine. She hesitated before opening her door, staring up at the house as if it were staring back at her. The air felt heavy, as though it were pressing down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. As they approached the front door, their footsteps crunched loudly against the gravel, each step echoing unnaturally in the vast silence. The door was massive, made of dark wood, and adorned with iron carvings that depicted strange symbols Zara didn't recognize. They seemed to writhe and twist in the dim light, giving her the unsettling feeling that they were watching her. The key was oversized and ancient, almost too large to fit in her hand, and it took both Zara and Amir to turn it in the lock. When the door finally creaked open, it revealed a vast entryway, larger than any room Zara had ever seen. The air inside was cold, far colder than it should have been for the time of year. Dust hung in the beams of light, filtering through the high, arched windows, and the floor beneath their feet groaned with every step. "This place has character," Zara murmured, her voice tinged with apprehension. She ran her fingers along the nearest wall, feeling the cold stone beneath a layer of dust. Her fingers came away gray and smudged. Amir was already bounding ahead, excitedly exploring the massive house. "Zara, look at this! The ceilings are like 30 feet high." His voice bounced off the cavernous walls, swallowed by the emptiness. Zara wandered deeper into the house, her eyes tracing the intricate woodwork along the staircases and the ancient chandeliers that dangled precariously from the ceilings. Everything felt too quiet, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. The old furniture, draped in white sheets, stood like ghosts in the dimly lit rooms, and as she passed them, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her, silently judging her presence. As the evening stretched on, Zara tried to shake the sense of foreboding that had settled in her chest. After a long day of unpacking, she stood by one of the large arched windows, looking out at the dense woods that surrounded them. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and move, playing tricks on her eyes. But when she blinked, they were still. The first night in the house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that amplifies every creak of the floor, every rustle of fabric, every heartbeat. Lying in bed, Zara found herself staring up at the high, vaulted ceiling, her mind racing. Amir had fallen asleep quickly, his soft snores the only sound breaking the silence. But Zara couldn't relax. The darkness in the house felt thicker than normal, oppressive, almost alive. Every now and then, she thought she heard something. A faint, almost imperceptible tapping sound. like someone lightly knocking on the walls from the inside. She strained her ears, holding her breath, but the sound stopped as soon as she focused on it. Just as Zara was beginning to drift into an uneasy sleep, she heard it, a slow, deliberate creak from above. Her eyes snapped open. The noise was coming from the ceiling, directly overhead, as if someone were walking in the attic. The footsteps were light but distinct, echoing through the silence of the house. Zara's heart pounded in her chest. She nudged Amir, who groaned and turned over. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Amir grunted. "It's probably just the house settling, babe. Old places make noises. Go back to sleep." But Zara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the attic to the other. It didn't sound like the house settling. It sounded like someone, or something, was up there, pacing, watching. She lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening to the faint sounds until they eventually faded into the stillness. But even after the footsteps stopped, the sense of being watched didn't leave her. She felt it. Something, somewhere, was observing her every move, waiting.
Unsettling discoveries. Massive extended version. Days passed, and Zara's unease grew stronger with each passing hour. While Amir busied himself with setting up the house, fixing the lights, moving furniture, Zara found herself wandering aimlessly through the vast, dark hallways, always on edge. It felt like every corner she turned, the house was hiding secrets from her. The air inside the home was cold, much colder than it should have been for early autumn, and no matter how many windows Amir opened or how often the fireplace was lit, the chill never left. One afternoon, Zara decided to explore the attic. It had been nagging at her ever since that first night when she heard the footsteps above their bedroom. The attic door was heavy and old, its hinges rusted and screaming in protest as she pulled it open. A cloud of dust billowed out, and the smell of damp wood and stale air hit her as she climbed the narrow stairs. The attic was larger than she had expected. It stretched out like a dark, forgotten cavern, with wooden beams crisscrossing overhead, casting shadows in the dim light. Old furniture, boxes, and trunks were scattered haphazardly, covered in thick layers of dust as though they hadn't been touched in decades. An eerie silence enveloped the room, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. As she explored, something caught her eye. A set of old portraits hanging on the far wall. The frames were ornate, gilded with gold, but the paintings inside were faded and worn, almost impossible to make out at first. Zara stepped closer, squinting at the figures in the portraits. They depicted a family, parents and children, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, standing solemnly in front of the house. But as she studied them, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The faces were blurred, as though smeared or scratched out intentionally. The more she looked, the more unsettling it became. The figures didn't seem entirely human. There was something off about their proportions, their expressions. She leaned in, staring at the largest portrait of the man, presumably the father, who stood at the center. His eyes seemed to follow her, and though they were nothing more than dark smudges, she felt as though he was staring straight into her soul. Zara's breath quickened. A strange sensation crept over her, like invisible fingers brushing against her skin. She felt watched, not just by the portraits, but by something else. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and a low hum filled her ears like a faint whisper she couldn't quite make out. She stepped back from the portraits, her heart pounding in her chest. Just as she was about to leave the attic, a loud bang echoed through the space. It came from one of the far corners, where an old, decrepit trunk sat. The lid of the trunk was shaking, vibrating as if something inside was trying to get out. Zara froze in place, her mind racing. She wanted to run, but her feet were glued to the floor. Slowly, the lid creaked open, just a fraction of an inch, and Zara could hear it, a soft, muffled whisper coming from inside the trunk. It was faint, barely audible but unmistakable. Someone or something was whispering her name. Zara ... Her throat went dry and her body trembled with fear. She backed away, her eyes fixed on the trunk as it slowly, ever so slowly, began to open wider. A cold breeze rushed out, carrying with it the musty scent of decay and something far worse. Something ancient, malevolent. Zara couldn't breathe. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a stack of old books as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. Zara ... The voice was closer now, as if it were right behind her. She spun around, but no one was there. Only the empty attic, silent and dark. The temperature dropped even further, and Zara's breath came out in ragged, visible puffs. Without thinking, she turned and bolted for the stairs, her heart pounding in her ears. As she ran, the whispering followed her, echoing off the walls, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was all around her, inside her head. She didn't stop running until she was out of the attic, slamming the door shut behind her, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She leaned against the door, gasping for breath, her mind reeling. What the hell had just happened? Was it her imagination? Or was there something in the house? Something that didn't want them there?
The locked room. Massive extended version. A few days later, while helping Amir organize the basement, Zara stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. The basement was dark, damp, and filled with the scent of mildew. Dim light bulbs flickered overhead, casting weak yellow light over the concrete floors and shelves lined with old, dusty tools. Zara had been sorting through boxes when she noticed it. A small, heavily padlocked door tucked away in the far corner of the basement. The door was old, far older than the rest of the house, with deep scratches and gouges covering the wood, as though someone or something had tried to claw their way out. The rusty, ancient lock looked like it hadn't been touched in years, and the hinges were nearly rusted shut. "Amir," Zara called out, her voice echoing through the basement. "Come look at this." Amir came over, wiping his hands on his jeans. He squinted at the door, frowning. That's weird. I didn't see this when we were down here last time." Zara stared at the door, her stomach twisting into knots. There was something about it that filled her with dread, an inexplicable sense of danger. She felt drawn to it, yet terrified of what lay behind it. The air around the door felt heavy, oppressive, and a faint, low hum seemed to emanate from it, like the sound of distant voices trapped behind the door. Amir knelt down and examined the lock. Looks pretty old. Wonder why it's locked. Think there's another part of the basement back there? Her eyes fixed on the door. No. Whatever's behind it, I don't think we should open it. Amir held it in his fingers. He tugged at the lock. It's probably nothing. Just an old storage room or something. I'll find a way to get it open later. But Zara couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every time she went down to the basement after that, she felt it. Presence. It lingered near the locked door, watching her, waiting. And every night, the sounds grew louder. The footsteps, the whispers, the soft rhythmic tapping on the walls. Each part will continue growing, pulling the reader deeper into the chilling, atmospheric horror. Let me know if you'd like more parts. Expanded similarly. The Hidden Journal, massive extended version. Zara's obsession with the locked door grew as days turned into weeks. She continued to hear strange noises at night, scraping sounds, whispering voices, and the occasional thud that made her heart race. Her curiosity about the locked room intensified, leading her to search the house for any clues that might explain its eerie presence. One day, while exploring the attic once more, Zara stumbled upon an old, dusty trunk hidden beneath a pile of cobweb-covered blankets. Her fingers trembled as she pried it open, revealing a collection of ancient papers and books. At the very top was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and faded, but still intact. Zara's hands shook as she opened the journal, revealing yellowed, brittle pages covered in a spidery script. The journal belonged to Elias, the previous owner of the house. The early entries described his excitement about moving in with his family, their hopes and dreams for the future. He wrote about the beauty of the home, the potential he saw in it, and his plans for renovations. But as the entries continued, the tone began to shift. Elias's writing became more erratic and desperate. He described strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, cold spots in the house, and disturbing dreams that left him waking in a cold sweat. His final entries were filled with paranoia, detailing his belief that the house was alive, watching him, and that something malevolent was lurking within its walls. One entry caught Zara's eye. "Something has awakened. I can feel it moving through the house, in the walls, beneath the floorboards. It watches us as we sleep. I've tried to leave, but the doors won't open. The windows won't budge. It's keeping us here." Zara's heart pounded as she read on. Elias's last few pages were nearly illegible, filled with frantic scribbles and torn edges. His final entry was a chilling warning. "Do not stay here. Leave before it's too late. The house has claimed us." Zara closed the journal, her hands shaking. The warnings were clear, but she had no intention of leaving. She had to understand what was happening, what Elias had experienced. The journal was just the beginning, and she knew that unlocking the door was the only way to uncover the truth. The Haunting Revelations, massive extended version. The house continued to reveal its dark secrets. Zara's fears grew as she started experiencing more disturbing phenomena. Shadows moved on their own, and objects would inexplicably shift from one place to another. Each night, she would hear the whispering voices, growing more coherent and demanding, echoing through the walls. One particularly eerie evening, while exploring the basement again, Zara found a hidden door behind a stack of old barrels. The door was small and barely noticeable, blending into the wall. She pried it open with a crowbar, revealing a narrow passage leading to a hidden room. The room was tiny, barely large enough for a person to stand in. It was filled with old, broken furniture and tattered books. In the center of the room was an old, iron-bound chest. Zara's breath quickened as she approached it. The chest was covered in strange symbols, similar to those on the locked door. With great effort, she managed to pry it open. Inside, she found a collection of old letters and photographs. The letters were written in a language she didn't understand, but the photographs were more disturbing. They showed the house at various points in history, but in each one, there were shadowy figures lurking in the background, dark, indistinct shapes that seemed to follow the house's occupants. One photograph stood out, a family portrait with Elias and his family, but in the background, a dark figure loomed, almost imperceptible, but undeniably present. It was the same figure she had seen in the portraits in the attic. Zara's hands trembled as she realized the significance. The house was not only haunted, it was actively seeking to ensnare its occupants, feeding off their fear and despair. She had to warn Amir, but he was increasingly dismissive of her concerns, attributing them to stress and fatigue. The Hidden Door, massive extended version. The more Zara uncovered, the more she felt trapped in a nightmare. She spent every waking moment trying to piece together the house's history and the nature of the entities that haunted it. Despite her mounting fears, Amir remained skeptical, attributing her experiences to stress and fatigue. One night, while Amir was away on a business trip, Zara decided to confront the locked door in the basement. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of grim determination, she descended into the cold, damp darkness. She tried to force the door open, but it was stubbornly resistant. The lock refused to budge, no matter how much she pulled or twisted. Frustrated, Zara used a wrench to pry at the edges of the door, and with a loud crack, the lock gave way. As the door creaked open, an overpowering stench of decay and mold wafted out. Zara shone her flashlight inside, revealing a small, dusty room filled with old, rotting furniture and piles of debris. At the center of the room was an old wooden table, on which lay a large bound book covered in strange symbols. Zara approached the table cautiously, her heart racing. She opened the book, revealing pages filled with cryptic symbols and disturbing illustrations. The illustrations depicted rituals and ceremonies, and the symbols were similar to those she had seen throughout the house. One page stood out, a ritual for summoning and binding spirits. Zara's blood ran cold as she realized the implications. The house was not merely haunted, it had been used for dark rituals. The spirits trapped within were not passive, they were actively seeking release. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. Zara felt an icy chill on the back of her neck and heard the whispering voices grow louder. Shadows moved in the corners of her vision, and the furniture seemed to shift, closing in on her. Panic set in. Zara slammed the book shut and fled from the room, slamming the door behind her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she knew that the house's secrets were far darker and more dangerous than she had imagined. The Terrors Unleashed. Massive Extended Version. The house's malevolent presence grew stronger. Zara's experiences became more intense and frightening. The whispering voices were now clearly calling her name, demanding that she join them in the shadows. The house seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and Zara felt increasingly isolated and trapped. One night, Zara awoke to find her bedroom door wide open, despite having locked it before bed. She felt a presence in the room, watching her. The shadows on the walls seemed to writhe and twist, and she saw dark figures moving in the corners of her vision. Desperate to understand what was happening, Zara researched the house's history. She discovered that it had been built on an ancient site of dark rituals and ceremonies. The land was said to be cursed, and the house had been a focal point for those seeking to summon and control dark forces. As Zara delved deeper, she learned of a ritual performed by the house's original owner to bind and trap malevolent entities. The ritual had failed, and the entities had been trapped within the house, feeding off the fear and despair of its occupants. One night, Zara was jolted awake by a series of loud bangs and crashes coming from the basement. She grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made her way downstairs. The basement was in disarray, with furniture overturned and objects scattered. The air was thick with an oppressive energy. In the center of the room was the old book she had found earlier. It was open to a page detailing a ritual to break the binding and release the trapped entities. Zara's hands shook as she read the instructions. She knew she had to perform the ritual to end the terror, but she also knew it would be dangerous. The Descent into Darkness. Massive Extended Version. Zara decided to perform the ritual despite the dangers. She gathered the necessary items, candles, incense, and other materials listed in the book, and prepared the basement for the ceremony. Her hands trembled as she set up the ritual space, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. As she began the ritual, the house seemed to come alive with a dark, malevolent energy. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows in the corners of the room danced and writhed. The temperature dropped further, and Zara could see her breath fogging in the cold air. The ritual required her to recite incantations and perform specific movements. As she did so, the room grew darker, and the shadows seemed to coalesce into dark, indistinct shapes. The entities trapped in the house were growing agitated, and Zara could feel their presence closing in on her. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Zara's flashlight fell to the floor, casting erratic beams of light that only served to intensify the horror. The shadows moved closer, and Zara could hear the entities whispering in her ears, their voices growing louder and more insistent. Zara continued the ritual, her voice trembling but determined. As she completed the final incantation, a blinding flash of light erupted from the ritual space. The house shook violently, and Zara was thrown to the final confrontation. Massive extended version. As Zara completed the final incantation of the ritual, the house seemed to erupt into chaos. The walls trembled, and a deep, guttural growl echoed through the air. Shadows swirled violently, and the temperature plummeted further. Zara could barely see through the disorienting whirl of darkness and light. A massive force seemed to press against her, almost as if the house itself was fighting back. The dark entities she had encountered before were now fully materialized, their forms twisted and grotesque. They hovered around her, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Zara could feel their icy breath on her skin and hear their whispers echoing in her mind. Desperately, she pressed on with the ritual, reciting the ancient words and performing the necessary gestures despite the overwhelming fear and exhaustion. The shadows seemed to pulse with anger, and the room shook with each utterance. Suddenly, one of the entities, a tall, dark figure with a featureless face, advanced toward Zara, its presence exuding pure malevolence. It seemed to be the leader of the group, the most powerful of the trapped spirits. Zara's heart raced as it approached, its dark form stretching and contorting as it moved. In a moment of sheer panic, Zara grabbed a nearby candle and thrust it toward the entity. The flame flickered, and the entity recoiled, hissing and wailing as if in pain. Zara seized the opportunity and intensified her recitation, channeling all her fear and desperation into the ritual. The house shook violently, and a blinding light filled the room. The dark entities screamed and writhed, their forms distorting and dissipating into the light. The oppressive weight of the house seemed to lift, and the temperature began to rise again. Zara fell to her knees, exhausted but relieved, as the light finally faded. The basement was silent, save for the occasional creak of the settling house. Zara looked around, seeing that the shadows had receded and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. The ritual was complete, and the entities had been banished. A new beginning. Massive extended version. The days following the ritual were a time of profound change for Zara and Amir. The house, once a dark and oppressive presence, now felt lighter and more welcoming. The shadows no longer moved on their own, and the whispers had disappeared. The oppressive cold had lifted, and the air felt fresh and clean. Amir, who had been skeptical throughout the ordeal, was now a firm believer in the supernatural. He noticed the changes in the house and expressed his gratitude to Zara for her bravery and determination. The two of them began to work together to make the house a true home, fixing up rooms and decorating to bring warmth and comfort to their new life. Despite the horrors they had faced, Zara and Amir found a sense of peace in their transformed home. They made it their mission to learn more about the house's history and to preserve its story. Zara continued to research and document her experiences, hoping to help others who might find themselves in similar situations. One evening, as Zara and Amir sat together in their newly renovated living room, they reflected on their journey. The house, once a source of fear and despair, had become a place of renewal and hope. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, their bond deepened by the shared ordeal. Zara looked around at the bright, welcoming space and smiled. The house, now free from its dark past, was finally their home. And as they settled in for a peaceful night, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The haunting of the alone new home was over, but its story would live on as a testament to courage and resilience. The house, once a prison of terror, had been transformed into a sanctuary, a place where new memories could be made and where the past could finally be laid to rest.